The conservative dirty tricks you see today are nothing new. They go back decades, and in some cases even centuries. You know the war on Christmas?
We've won the first battle in the war on Christmas.
That goes back to 1959.
If there's one thing that will always astound me, it is how fundamentally uncreative Republicans are.
Far-right founder of the John Birch Society, Robert Welch, had written a pamphlet saying that globalists were trying to replace conventional Christmas decorations with United Nations insignia. It's the same crap every time. Joseph McCarthy and his unhinged conspiracies are a treasure trove for this kind of deja vu. In 1954, Utah Governor J. Bragg Lee followed McCarthy's lead. He gave a speech talking about how communist subversives had contaminated our schools and churches. 70 years later,
when did our public schools, any schools, become what are essentially grooming centers for gender identity radicals?
During the 1970s, Miami approved a law that banned discrimination for housing based on sexual orientation. A woman named Anita Bryant led a campaign against that called Save Our Children, you know, from the gays. It's been 50 years and Republicans are still using kids as an excuse to oppress LGBTQ people. And they haven't even changed the tagline.
They want to sexualize our children.
Molding children within the view of these marginalized extremists.
This is an attack on your children and you should fight back.
It's all the same stuff, repackaged in a shiny new container that oppresses a different, or maybe the same, minority. It's important to know that. It makes it easier to not take the bait. And yes, this is all dangerous, this is all destructive. But it's also boring and tired. Conservatives, get some new material.
So this TikTok by Kat M. Abu points out the sheer absurdity of the Republican Party using the same exact stale talking points for literal decades now. And I want to touch on why these talking points work and what exactly these talking points are really meant to tap into. Now, fundamentally, the United States rests on this like white supremacist narrative of every man being a king of their castle and their women and children being their property. And then it offers this promise to like mothers of, oh, you get to be this homemaker and spend all of your time taking care and raising your children. You know, aside from, of course, literally being treated as property. But then, of course, it paints this narrative of there being these menacing threats from outside in society. And thus, of course, the menacing threats in their mind end up just being like marginalized people. Because fundamentally, that is what is used to justify the marginalization of people, right? They paint Black and brown folks as being inherently predatory or something. They do the same thing with queer folk. And this whole notion of property is also really important because they view children as property, which is one of the reasons why they're so upset about the existence of queer folks. Because if your kid can grow up to be gay or trans, well then golly gee, that might imply that children are their own human beings with agency and not actually property. I know, shocker. But in order to make this work, they have to create like elevated levels of baseline fear. And that's why so many local news outlets and right-wing outlets, and even supposedly left-wing outlets, will spend basically all day doing a bunch of different random crime reporting, because they want to create this like baseline level of fear and terror. And that's where you end up getting these Republicans who will constantly talk about how not only tough they are and imagine themselves as John Rambo, but also at the same time are terrified of the idea of like going downtown or like walking in a city, which is of course why you have so many Republicans that are intent on like buying these like massive trucks and SUVs, because once again, they imagine that the whole world is out to get them. And that really is at the heart of this. Fundamentally, these right-wingers continue to use the same lines that have been used for hundreds of years, and especially in Nazi Germany. These lines were very much used, where they painted this imagery of different groups of marginalized people coming to specifically get your children in an effort to try and mobilize the suburban middle class into these extremely reactionary beliefs by hijacking people's natural instinct to care for their children and want to protect their children, and subverting it in such a way that they make every other possible human being some sort of threat to their children. These right-wingers stir up these like ridiculous witch hunts against whatever marginalized community they think is convenient in the moment. And so right now it's trans people. But we know that throughout history in the United States, there are many different groups of marginalized people that have been the center of right-wing attention, especially when it comes to the save our children, or in its closely related rhetorical cousin, protect our women. And the key word there is our. Once again, this whole notion of women and children lacking agency and being personal property of men in their lives is sort of at the root of this. It's about denying agency for women, it's about denying agency for children, and then painting other people in society that they might interact with as some sort of malicious threat. But the reason why you'll see a lot of like middle class white suburban moms jump in on the turf train or on the extreme racism is because under our system they're afforded a certain degree of privileges and wealth and assumed innocence so long as they play along with this white supremacist patriarchy. And it's made a heck of a lot easier to maintain when you consider the extreme amount of fear that is intentionally pumped through televisions into these people's minds that has them literally so terrified that some people think they need to like buy a tank to drive to Target or pick up their kids from school. The solution to this really is that right-wingers just need to go outside and like live in the real world for like a few minutes and recognize that it's not actually the scary place that they think it is. I know this is shocking, but I live in Minneapolis and it actually didn't burn down. I know, what a shocker. But like this just goes to show like how deeply unhinged these right-wingers are. They're quite literally afraid of basically everybody. And that is something that Fox News and the political right use to justify targeting marginalized groups. So much so that it often boils up into the extremes where you see right-wing vigilantes committing literal terrorist attacks that are targeted towards marginalized people. We have literally in the past year seen bomb threats against children's hospitals because they were treating transgender children, and then we've also seen over the past decade several shootings at queer nightclubs. And that is just like the two that I can easily rattle off the top of my head. There literally have been dozens of instances like this. And the unfortunate reality is hate crimes against trans people in particular are on the rise. But that is exactly what the right wing wants. The right wing wants to use fear to turn it into violence against queer folks, black and brown folks, you name it. Whether that be direct individualized violence, vigilantism, or the larger systemic violence of denying people access to housing, healthcare, food, jobs, all of the things that you need to live. And the reason why they do that under our capitalist system is because capitalism fundamentally depends on hyper-exploitable classes in order to drive wages down. Because capitalism, at its root, always depends on the reserve army of labor, which is people who are intentionally kept chronically unemployed and underserved in our economy, so that if they ever do need to do layoffs, they can reach out to people who have been marginalized, who have been sidelined, and offer them jobs in order to try and get them to be scabs. Or can paint some fields of work as inherently undesirable and use that to justify lower wages, which is why these right-wingers also talk about how much they hate baristas and fast food workers, despite the fact that they love going to Starbucks and they love going to McDonald's. It's just that they think that the people who should be working those jobs are undesirable to them. And so on one hand, this is just another ridiculous, boring, stale thing that these Republicans are trying to mainstream. But on the other hand, this is something that is actively very, very dangerous for many people who live inside the United States that are subjected to the violence of the political right.